After two programming friends started their game company, Parallax Software, they created the hit Descent. But only a few years later, Matt Toshlaw grew tired of Champaign, Illinois and started a new studio elsewhere. The other founder, Mike Koulis, wanted to hang around for just a little longer and planned to meet up with Matt shortly. It never happened. His temporary new studio, Volition Incorporated, stayed in Champaign for good and thrived by producing hits like Free Space and Red Faction. However, alongside their big sellers were a few projects that hadn't gone as well as expected, like Free Space 2 and the role-playing game Summoner. The game Tube Racer hadn't even gotten past the concept art stage. And going forward, they'd be seeing more than a few projects that would never see the light of day. But even after their toughest moments, Volition bounced back to create their biggest successes to date. After releasing Summoner in 2000 and Red Faction in 2001, in 2002, Volition finished both Summoner 2 and Red Faction 2. After the lukewarm reviews of the original, Volition made a number of changes to Summoner 2 that made it better in every way. It went fully real-time for its battles, giving the RPG a more action-heavy focus than its competitors. It also managed to expand on both the story and the world, while at the same time reducing many of the bugs and loading issues of its predecessor. Reviews across the board were stronger. Therefore, it sold less. Wait, what? As with Free Space 2 before it, Summoner 2's genuine improvements weren't enough to draw gamers back a second time.
Summoner 2, much better game, didn't actually sell as well as Summoner 1, so that's kind of the frustration of this industry. Sometimes you know you did a much better job, but people just don't buy the game sometimes.
Meanwhile, Red Faction 2 was having much the same response. While again being praised as an improvement over the original, it sold slightly less, though was still well within profitability. The game did change a number of elements from its predecessor, including a much lighter emphasis on destructible environments and a shift in location from Mars to Earth. The changes might have been too much for fans' tastes. Either way, the game's reception is often looked back on as a low moment for the company.
The reviews, if you look at Metacritic or game rankings, are a few percentage points below Red Faction 1. It's one of my frustrations that people think, oh, Red Faction 2 was a failure. And yes, you know, sales-wise it dropped, ratings-wise it dropped a little bit, but the game was very profitable. And it's still, the ratings, I think they were like 82, 83, which is a very strong rating.
As unfortunate as all this was, it wasn't nearly as bad as what was to come. After Red Faction 2, Volition began work on 3 separate projects. Every single one of them would be cancelled. Summoner 3 and Red Faction 3 were both begun, but after their precursors sold less than expected, those projects were scrapped. But then, Volition got rolling on a game that they really felt had a lot of potential, Underground, which would see the player taking the role of a thief in England. Sadly, about a year into development, Grand Theft Auto 3 released from Rockstar Games. Like Underground, GTA was an open-world game. But GTA was filled to the brim with limitless possibilities, from carjacking to fighting tanks. Underground, despite letting the player go anywhere, was a more linear experience. Fearing that it would just be buried by Rockstar's juggernaut, THQ canceled Underground. Volition just needed a project to work on that would definitely go through, so they took on their first, and so far only, licensed title, The Punisher. Despite the film of a year earlier, the Volition crew chose to keep the game closer to its hyper-violent comic book roots. As such, not only was the shooting aspect incredibly bloody, but the game also featured a distinctive interrogation mechanic. There were hundreds of scenarios in which the Punisher would torture a bad guy for information. And depending on how well the player did it, he could either get the info or kill the poor thug. It was, in fact, so over the top that the ESRB wouldn't even give it a mature rating until Volition visually distorted the most violent sections.
I think there's still this sense of, there certainly was at the time, video games are for kids, and therefore we have to protect kids from this thing, when in fact it was an M-rated game, and I think, you know, there's movies that are acceptable for adults, for, you know, for older teenagers, for, you know, for a wide range of ages. I think people accept that in other forms of media, and for some reason it's not, you know, games are just viewed as kid stuff.
Even for all of that, after 3 whole years without releasing a product, just getting the Punisher onto store shelves was considered a victory. Meanwhile, another Volition crew was crafting a PlayStation 2 open-world game called Bling Bling. However, it didn't take long for the PS2 game to change to an Xbox 360 one, and the name to switch to Saints Row. After Underground's linear experience had been defeated by Grand Theft Auto's do-as-you-please philosophy, Saints Row would attempt to do GTA 1 better by letting the player go as crazy as he wanted. It featured even loonier humor, and the overall tone was just that one step more ridiculous than Rockstar's game, which itself was heavily stylized.
I don't want you bitching out when you see your crew.
Ain't my crew, son. That's why I'm here, remember? So how about you put your dick away, pick up your gun, and try to keep your knee away from the bullets.
And it seemed to resonate with audiences, as the demo was downloaded 350,000 times in its first week, the most in Xbox Live history up to that time. Once inside, they found a game that had tight and responsive controls with a huge variety of side quests rounding out a focused mission structure. On top of that, the game even had multiplayer, both competitive and co-op. And so, even though most critics called it out for being a GTA clone, they also said that in some ways it actually improved on its inspiration. Whatever they thought, the game turned into Volition's biggest hit since Red Faction by selling 2 million copies. For that matter, Red Faction's main antagonist, the evil Ultor Corporation, even makes a cameo appearance in Saints Row, theoretically bridging those two franchises. How could Saints Row possibly get any more insane? How about if Volition started work on the sequel a year before the first game even finished?
So about a year before Saints Row 1 shipped, we had probably about 5 people on Saints Row 2. Yeah, they were working on it for a long time, and it's difficult. We don't really know what's going to work. You're going to be wrong in some cases, you know. The stuff you thought was really good, customers may not care that much about, and other things that are in the game, you might learn that that's what they really like, and that's what you want to, amplify and deliver more of in the next one.
Wilder, wackier, and more bonkers in every way, Saints Row 2 released in 2008 for both the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, and later for the PC. After the success of the first game, THQ launched a massive marketing assault for the sequel. Combined with the original's reputation, it all added up to another major success for Volition and the cementing of Saints Row as their new flagship franchise. And only a year later, yet another crew finished up Red Faction Guerrilla, the third game in their sci-fi series. It came to the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, and was in fact brought to the PC by none other than Parallax co-founder Matt Toshlog's new studio. It released in 2009 after a 5-year development cycle, the longest in Volition's history. They'd used the time to perfect Geomod 2.0, an engine that completely changed how they approached destructible environments. It now had a full physics and stress model running, so that structures would collapse realistically no matter how the player tore it apart.
The physics simulation is running all the time, so if you build an unstable building, the building will collapse. So if you had, now in most games you just build a building, whatever it looks like is fine, it's not going to collapse. It was the most sort of iterative, back and forth development that we've ever had, and that's why the game took so long to build.
The title returned the action to Mars, but changed up the format a little. For one thing, it was now a third-person shooter instead of first-person. For another, instead of being linear, Red Faction was now open world, on another world. There was some fear that fans would be upset by all the changes. Instead, thanks in no small part to its destructibility and sandbox approach, Guerrilla showed that the franchise still had weight in the gaming market. It should be no surprise that having established 2 successful franchises after years of canceled projects, Volition greenlit sequels for both, and as it happens, they will both release in 2011. Red Faction Armageddon will release on June 7th, and Saints Row the 3rd sometime in the fall. Armageddon will once again see some changes to the series, going back to a linear campaign structure and removing competitive multiplayer in favor of co-op. That said, it is keeping the destructibility and even throwing alien monsters into the mix for good measure. And in a bold marketing move by THQ, Red Faction also has a TV movie in the works to flesh out the story world. Meanwhile, little is currently known about the third Saints Row, other than that it will have a more international vibe than its American Street predecessors. In the meantime, Volition is also at work on the first of a series of games masterminded by hyperrealist filmmaker Guillermo del Toro. Little is known about the game other than that it will be a horror title called Insane, and is scheduled to release in 2013. But they will be doing it all without their founder. On May 2nd, 2011, Mike Kulish chose to leave the company behind after 15 years, 18 if you count his time with Parallax Software. He stated that it was a move he'd been considering for nearly a year and wasn't prompted by any specific event. But he goes knowing that after some rocky times and tough breaks, Volition now heads forward with 2 solid franchises and the passion project of a gifted filmmaker. The studio is bigger today than it has ever been, and its potential has never been greater. Not bad for something that started as a couple of guys with nothing but the desire to do it.